Activating octoscope. It's heading straight for us. Sound the octo alert.
Uh-oh.
Permission to come aboard.
Hey everyone, Hashi here, and welcome to Cheap Tricks, where we teach you how to recreate effects from big Hollywood movies. I recently saw the trailer for AQUAMAN, where it looks like we'll get to spend a good amount of time under the waves. Now, something incredible happened right as this tutorial was coming together. Red Giant announced the release of a new, amazing feature for Trapcode Particular and Form called Fluid Dynamics. It's so cool that I'm actually splitting this tutorial into two. Part 1 is about the dry for wet approach, making your dry shots look like they were filmed underwater. And Part 2 explores Trapcode's new fluid dynamics and creating fun cinematic scenes like these, from scratch. Splash these tutorials together, and you've got a course in creating some amazing material right at home, proving that you can do anything you set your mouse to. Let's fire up the Octopod and pay our fishy friends a visit on today's episode. For over 100 years, filmmakers have used different tricks to create the illusion of being underwater. It's a real pain to film underwater, and sometimes it just isn't practical to film practically. Like when you want an indoor space to look like it's submerged, or you've got an expensive model you don't want to get wet. On this episode of Cheap Tricks, we'll be talking about some techniques to turn this into this. We're giving away this underwater look template to jumpstart your process, as well as some elements that you can layer into your shot nicely to create some pretty cool looks. We're also going to talk about using Particular to add bubbles and dynamic swarms of fish to your comp. Now to keep everything straight, let's divide the underwater look into two broad categories: the look and the elements. In terms of look, underwater footage tends to be bluish, have volumetric light, both from on-screen sources and from above frame. The camera is often handheld or floaty, and the motion of objects is slow. The footage is also generally murky. Things fall off the farther they are away from camera. And lastly, sometimes the image can appear wavy or distorted. Now how about the elements that tell you we're underwater? First, we've got our floating bits, just a bunch of little particles swirling around. We see caustics, or light ripples, that dance along various surfaces. Perhaps fish or other animals may swim by. And underwater foliage is usually sprinkled around and grows around stuff. Moving objects create bubbles that either enhance their motion or float to the surface. And to create your underwater look, you can use some or all of the things on these lists. It depends on the shot and your art direction. Now let's dive in. You're going to want the right type of footage. Pools of light in a dark, foggy environment work best. The brighter your footage is, the more challenging it may become. Daylight exteriors are a no-go. If you're using stock footage, like this awesome material provided by Pond 5, you're going to want something like this. Something dilapidated might lend itself to looking like the elements have taken their toll. If you're shooting your own material, here are several suggestions. Use a darker, sparsely lit area, especially with top-down lighting. Fog machines work wonders. They can create a soupy feel and add volume to all of your lighting. Plus, they're pretty affordable. Heck, go buy one the week after Halloween when they're on clearance. Kick it on and then waft that fog around so it's more uniform. Now, all your light sources will have cool volumetric light coming off of them, just like in water. If you want to get fancy, you could even get a projector and project caustic patterns onto everything for some practical effects lighting. This would work the best from the top down if you can manage that in your space. I'm using my garage for this demo, so I'm lighting it from the side, but at the very least your kids will get a big kick out of this. Film at a higher frame rate to take advantage of slow motion. It's harder to move quickly underwater, and if you have an actor involved, frankly it becomes a lot less believable if they can move around too easily. And those are the basics for getting some good material to start with. Now let's dive into After Effects and get our feet wet. I'm going to convert these 3 clips into some fun underwater scenes, and after that I'll show you the template I cooked up for you guys based on what I learn along the way. The beginning of this tutorial will show you how I honed the underwater look step by step. I'll get detailed, and I'll also provide some useful After Effects tips along the way. But if you want to skip ahead to my summary of the downloadable template, you can always use the table of contents in the description below. Now let's start with clip number 1. I got this staircase footage from pond5.com. It's a simple, dirty environment, staircase. The caked up dirt along the side of the stairs will really help sell that underwaterness. I'm going to use that list we made earlier as a rough guide for what changes I should make to this footage. My first step is almost always to motion track the footage. Once I get a good result, I set the ground plane and origin. I create a solid and camera here too. I continue to use the plane creation tool to put stand-in planes on all of the key surfaces. Then I'll label these too. These locators will be really helpful once I start placing extra elements within this environment. And with that, it's time for pro tip number 1 of this episode: normalizing your 3D world. You never know what the scale of your 3D tracked world will be. Sometimes it's reasonable and sometimes it's astronomical, so I like to use this little trick. Once I'm sure I've created all the planes and locators that I need from the camera tracker, I normalize the whole 3D world. And it's actually very simple. Step 1, use the widgets to align your ground plane visually with the footage. The green Y widget should be pointing into the distance, and the red X widget should be pointed screen right. Step 2, parent all of the 3D objects, including the camera, to your ground plane. Step 3, open up the position of your ground plane and set it to 960 by 540 by 0. Step 4, set the orientation to 270, 0, 0. For a standard HD comp, this means that your ground plane is centered and properly oriented, so up is up, down is down, and left and right are square to the world space of After Effects. And then for step 5, we need to adjust the scale of the 3D world. I do this by creating a solid that's the size of the comp. I make it 3D, but leave it unparented and scaled to 100%. You'll notice that it should appear right in the center of my ground plane. Now, if I open up the scale of the ground plane, I can adjust it up or down until that solid is about the same size as my frame, just roughly. Once that's done, I can unparent everything from the new ground plane. Now this 3D scene is what I call normalized. That means when I import a new piece of footage or create a solid or text item, they'll appear right in the center of this 3D world, oriented properly and easily moved in X, Y, and Z space as defined by After Effects. This will save me the time of repositioning and rescaling every piece of footage I bring in, and it's also really helpful for any plugins that utilize the 3D space. Particle effects like Particular and Form will be really happy, and 3D effects like Video Copilot's Element will have a great head start when you create. And now on with the episode. Color correction is the next step on our journey. As a starter, I'm going to apply Magic Bullet looks. After shopping around, I settle on the classic hot and cold look. Pretty neat. Next, I'll add Trapcode Shine to create some volumetric light. I'll slide it up in the effects stack, and I'll also select the Aqua Light preset under Colorize. Next, I can tell Shine to use a 3D light as its source point, and then create a light called Shine 1. By pushing this light back in 3D space, I can create the illusion that the light's coming from some distant point behind this building. And this is already looking great. Now, the brightly lit trees outside this window are kind of bumming me out, so I'm going to create a copy of my back wall solid, rename it to Window Matte, and then do some slight repositioning and draw mask shapes in these windows. With a few simple keyframes and a subtract mask to block them from when the staircase occludes them, I can switch this layer into an adjustment layer and throw a fast blur and toner effect on them. Now these windows still function as a light source, but it's less obvious that there's like trees and stuff out there. Now jumping back into Shine, I can utilize the fractal noise pattern to make these light rays look a little bit more organic. I'll select the 3D light with parallax and use the cutout blending mode. Next I'm going to add CC Vignette. It'll just make the space feel a little bit more mysterious and dark toward the edges. I'm also going to dive back into Looks and play with the S-curve module a little bit. And there we are. That about covers our full checklist for the look category. And now it's time to add a few elements to help sell the idea we're underwater. Let's start with the floating debris. Trapcode form is just perfect for this. I'll add a solid with form, and then open the designer window to get a head start on the look. Let's select the cloudlet particles and create a box grid, adjusting the number of particles in the grid until we have a kind of uniform look. I'll add some randomness to the size of these particles, dial up the disperse value, and the fractal field influence. And let's go with that for starters. As you can see, this box grid appears right in the middle of our ground plane, which is great. From there I can push and pull the position of the box and resize the whole shape to fill the space. Once it's the right size, I can turn down the opacity of some of these particles so they look like just light debris. I'll also play with the fractal field settings until I like the floating speed of these particles. Once I like all that, I notice that there's this column right at the very beginning of the footage, and it'd be nice if I could have it occlude these particles. So I create a copy of the front column solid. I scale it and mask it properly, and then apply it as an inverted alpha matte. There we are. Next on our list is Caustics. These are the patterns created by light passing through a water surface. They're pretty simple to generate in After Effects. Just throw some fractal noise on a solid, then Alt or Option click to add an expression to the evolution, and put something like time times 250, so it keeps on changing over time. And then add some vector blur to this, and bam, you're in business. Now the vector blur settings depend a bit on the scale of your noise pattern, but you can always tweak both of these together until you get a result you like. I'm going to preemptively add a feathered mask around this whole thing so there are no harsh edges. Now I can take that caustic card and introduce it as a 3D element to my scene. If I know I want to align it with one of the surfaces I have a stand-in for, I could just duplicate that layer and then Alt-Option drag the caustic card to replace it. I change the blending mode to add or screen and double check that within the layer properties the layer doesn't accept lights. And this is looking pretty great. Now, water is dense, so it can distort and diffract the image behind it. I found that an instance of Universe Heatwave can be used to create this effect. By adjusting the blur and heat size to match your comp's scale, and setting the flow speed a little bit lower, you can create some really subtle distortions around the image that feel wet. I really wanted to add some underwater plants to this thing, and my solution at first was to create this bunch of seaweed using Trapcode Mirror, putting it on a card and then kind of placing that around the scene. I came up with a better solution for this later, so I'm going to kind of skip over it for now. But speaking about adding life to this thing, how about some fish? I'd love to see some fish swim through here, and I'd like them to be at least a little bit animated. Now, you could download a picture of any fish you want and like puppet tool it in After Effects if you like. But I'm going to go a step further, because I want to teach you to fish, and I want to give you a fish too at the end of this all. So I jump over to Sketchfab, where I found this great Creative Commons fish that was animated and uploaded by user PC Noodles. I open it up in Cinema 4D, where I can copy and paste the start keyframes to the end and create a looping animation. Then I use Riptide Pro to export the animated sequence as OBJs, so I can use them in After Effects and render them with Element 3D. Now, this fish was a really nice shape, and it was rigged, which is swell, but its texture was really minimal, and I don't want to stick you guys with this thing. So I'm going to hop into Photoshop and hack apart some fish skin onto this texture. Just pushing, pulling, cloning, using the liquefy window to mold these shapes and images to the original texture map. I'm also using one of my favorite sheets, which is the smudge tool set to 100%, basically allowing you to stretch out pixels using brush strokes. So I can save this file and double check my work in Element as I go. And these eyes are a little hard to line up. I've got kind of a situation going on. There we go. So now that we're all textured up, I've got this animated 3D fish that works with Element. I'm going to give this away to you guys so you can play with it if you have Element, but I'm also going to render out a 500 by 500 sprite, so you can use it the same way that I will in the rest of this episode, using Trapcode Particular. So let's jump back over to our staircase comp, add a new solid, and apply Particular. In the emitter settings, I'll set the direction to directional. Then I'll set the Y rotation to about 90 degrees. Next, I'll choose a box emitter and tweak the size a bit. Now I can move my emitter off screen to the left here. I'll set some keyframes on my particle count so there's some particles and then none again. And I'll also increase the life of my particles so they last the whole time they're on screen. So now's a good time to drag in that PNG sequence of the fish I rendered out earlier. I can simply place it in the comp and then turn it off. Now in my particular solid, under particle type, I can select textured polygon, and then for the texture, I can select my fish side view. I'll leave random loop as the time sampling mode, which means that all of these fish will loop randomly from different parts of the animation. Now watch as I increase the particle size and hit play. Fish darts. Under the emitter settings, I'll adjust the random velocity to spread out these fish more. Then, under particle rotation, I'll select a very useful tool, Orient to Motion, which will keep these fish noses pointed in the right direction. Because these fish point in whatever direction they're moving, I can get some really cool results if I scroll down to Physics, Air, and increase the spin amplitude. Now keep in mind that these are 2D sprites, and there's a point at which they'll look wrong. But even in a pretty high spin value, since these fish are primarily moving laterally, they really look like they're swimming. For some better overall looks, I can turn the motion blur on under the rendering settings, and turn up the opacity boost a bit. I can also go to shading and turn shadowlets for main on. This kind of shading gives me some very quick depth to the group and breaks up the monotony a bit. Now turning back to my physics settings, a quick reminder that spin affects the behavior of an individual particle, but turbulence fields affect the whole group. I'll tell my turbulence field to affect the position. Then it's important to experiment with the scale of the field. The higher the value will give you a very bumpy result. I prefer to turn the scale of my turbulence fields down to around 2 or 3. Then, depending on your effect position value, the lower turbulence field scale values can result in some really nice wide swirls. Next, I'll add some color correction to these particles, just darkening them a bit, and then using my good old friend CC Light Sweep to create an artificial rim when the fish are right in front of this middle lighted area. In fact, I'm actually able to link the origin of the light sweep to the light I created earlier for shine. To do that, I'm using a little expression called the toComp expression, which gives you the 2D position of where a 3D object appears on screen. Stu Maschwitz covers this technique really well in his behind the scenes from Tank, and really is an expression that no comper should be without. Anyway, color correct to your heart's content, my friends. But when you're ready to add some zing to these fish, I humbly suggest going to your particular settings and enabling the aux system, which emits particles from other particles. If I select sphere as the type and scrub forward a bit, you can see that spheres are now emitting from the position of these fish particles. I'll create a curve for the size over life so they kind of fade off over time, even though real bubbles don't actually get smaller over life, they can't. And I'll adjust the aux physics to give some negative gravity and turbulence, so the bubbles kind of float up and away. You know, I'm feeling pretty good on this example, so let's move on to clip number 2. Also from Pond 5, this is a beautiful cruise ship interior. I'll track the camera right out of the gate and do the same thing as before, defining a handful of planes I can use to start understanding the space. This particular camera solve only returned a tripod-style result, so I don't have the true parallax I'm supposed to have here, but I can make this work. I can take a big shortcut by hopping back over to my first shot and copying over the main adjustment layers and the shine light, and then just pasting them in here. This footage is much brighter and more saturated than the previous clip, so the color correction isn't perfect right away, but you can see the beginning of how a template could allow you to have a lot of these first steps out of the way. I'm going to fast forward through me upping the vignette amount and darkening the image, adding a glow, and finally throwing in universe Heatwave on top of the adjustment layer. Next, I'll repeat what I did before with form. I'll add a solid, add a form. The specifics really aren't important to follow along with here because they'll vary by your comp size, but the principle is this. Create a 3D grid of particles, disperse those particles, and then displace all of those using a flowing fractal field. Do I sound smart? I'm trying so hard, you guys. Alright, let's turn on our shine layer again and get artsy with the shine locator right in the center of the chandelier. I'll play with the shine settings until I get just the right amount of rays coming out of the mid-screen and get kind of a cool look going on here, working underwater lights and everything. And now I'm going to do something really fishy, by which I mean I'm going to create a dynamic swarm of fish that do something much more art-directed. Say some visionary out there decides he wants a swarm of fish to come spiral around this chandelier in a pretty way. Well, it turns out Trapcode Particular has an amazing tool to do just this. I touched a little bit on this in episode 1. This episode 1 of Cheap Tricks, in which we learned that particles can flow along the path of a designated light. Now, I'm going to do just that, but with the added challenge of these particles needing to flow in front and behind the chandelier. Step 1 is creating a 3D object that stands in for the chandelier. I'll create a guide plane, oriented toward the camera and basically aligned with my chandelier. I'll draw a mask around the solid center of this fixture, and then I'll do what only an idiot would do, which is draw a really complex shape with lots of points on a single mask. I'm actually not that worried about it in this case because the fidelity of this mask isn't super critical for this comp. I'll set some keyframes for the masks on frame 1 and then jump to the end frame and slightly tweak everything. And now when I scrub from the beginning to the end, I have a pretty decent 3D stand-in card with a similar alpha. Step 2 is creating a point light called Motion Path 1. Whenever you add a light, obviously the layers react, and it's no biggie. Selecting a layer and double tapping A will allow you to quickly turn Accept Lights to off. And you can do this for all the 3D layers at once if you want, if it's bugging you. Anyway, we're going to keyframe this light to fly in from off screen and then swirl around the chandelier. I'll start by sliding the light off screen, setting a quick keyframe. I can use F11 and F12 on my keyboard to pop between a custom 3D view and my comp camera. Or I can take this fun approach and switch to a top view and then enable 2 views horizontally. So just like in a 3D program, I can watch the framing and a reference view at the same time. Now this allows me to just keep inching forward and adding keyframes of this light swirling around the chandelier, adjusting the tangents along the way, and ultimately sculpting this fun shape. It's actually really aesthetically pleasing, I think. And now time for another pro tip. I'm making this 3D path for the light, but I worked really haphazardly in terms of timing, but After Effects has a great solve for this. Watch as I select all of the keyframes in the middle, leaving the first and last. Then I can right-click and say Rove-Across-Time, which will then have AE space out these keyframes to respect the timing established by only those outer keyframes. Right now, the spacing along the whole path will be consistent. And you can see that as I alter these paths, I'm really editing the shape only, and the keyframes are automatically positioning themselves to keep a constant speed. If you wanted to, you could even turn the first or last keyframes into ease keyframes and shape their velocity, and you'd be able to work with one simplified velocity curve, even though there's many points along the way. So let's put this cool path to work. I'll import that PNG sequence of fish, and I'll use it later as a sprite. I'll need a solid with particular, and then I'll just solo these layers so we can really focus on this effect. Once I've got particular in there, for the emitter position, I'm going to use this expression, where I'm taking the position of the motion path 1 layer, specifically at value time 0. That means the particular will spew out particles from wherever I move this motion path to be at time 0, the beginning of my curve. Now on my particular layer, I can scroll down to the physics, open up air, and then I can select a motion path. Since I named my light motion path 1, I have the option to choose from 1 or 1HQ, which is a slightly higher quality. Now, just to illustrate what we're working with here, I'll set the particle velocity to 0 for a second and just hit play. Cool, huh? Now I've got this editable motion path and the particles flowing along it. The next thing I'm going to do is scroll down to Particular's visibility settings. I'm going to go to the obscuration layer and select my Chandelier stand-in. I'll be sure to check Effects and Masks, and then I can hide that layer. And instantly I have particles that appear to be obscured by the chandelier. Just like with my other swarm of fish, I'll keyframe the amount of particles to increase and then fall off. Then I'll change my emitter type to a sphere and fine-tune the size a bit. And now I can preview this really cool swarm. Now I'm ready for my fish particles. So let's go to Particle Type and select Textured Polygon and set the fish as the texture. I'll dive down into the particle rotation and enable Orient to Motion, and now I can see these sprites wrap around this path in all their glory. Now these truly are just 2D cards, so there's a real strength in numbers aspect to this all. With a large enough school of fish, it's okay that some of them almost disappear on angle. The swarm as a whole is more prominent than any one flat fish. The particles per second really help shape the density of this swarm, so I'll create a bit of a curve that's heavy at first and then tapers off. This will become visible in the shape of the fish swarm as it heads in. Now this clip isn't that long, and so my original path actually demanded that the